Hey guys, Extus Justin here, and welcome to today's episode. And today I have a friend with me who is Devlin Blake. And Devlin, say hey to everyone.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome, love it, love it. And Devlin, tell us a bit about what it is that you do.
Well, I am a book coach. Some people will also call that a writing coach. I help people write their nonfiction business books, their fiction novels, and also their memoirs.
hmm Perfect, perfect. And how long have you been doing this?
Well, I've been a coach. That is a complicated question because I used to be a ghostwriter. And as a ghostwriter, I wrote 200 books where I developed these systems that I now teach to other people to write their books.
hmm Okay, so you're a ghostwriter.
Used to be a ghostwriter, yes.
That is awesome. I had a few friends. I've been networking a bit on Facebook, and I've had a few friends who said they do something similar. So with ghostwriting, how does that process work?
Well, how that process works is a person who has a story to tell hires a
hmm
ghostwriter. Now,
hmm
most of the time, people who hire ghostwriters are usually doing business books or memoirs. There's some call for novel writing ghostwriters. There's not a lot, but I have written novels as a ghostwriter too.
hmm
And basically, there are two ways to work with a ghostwriter on that. The first way is if it's a person who is used to working with a ghostwriter, they come with their own very detailed outline, show you the outline, and basically say, write this book. Now, that's not most people. I would say that's about 10% of the people who work with ghostwriters. The rest of the population who works with ghostwriters have never written a book before, don't know how to start writing an outline, and they're looking for someone who can basically coach them through that. So this type of ghostwriter has a series of interviews with the person to figure out what it is they want, and then they use that skill to craft the book.
hmm And is there a typical length in terms of how long it takes to write a book? What do you find?
Well, of course, that depends on the type of book
hmm
and the length of book. Like business books are pretty easy to write and they can be written fairly quickly. Novels take more time, and memoirs, because they're such a personal book, then they take usually the most time.
hmm Perfect. In your case, what's the longest it's taken to write a book as a ghostwriter?
Hmm. As a ghostwriter, I don't take that long to write a book, but it depends on the quality of the outline. Because if
hmm
there's not an outline and I have to work with interviews and from scratch, obviously it takes longer than if someone just handed me an outline.
hmm Okay, perfect, perfect. And I was just looking through your bio, and it definitely seems like writing has been your life, right?
Definitely. I love to write and I love to read because you
hmm
can't be a good writer without being a good reader.
Yeah, so perfect. And tell me how it all started for you. What was your first before you actually got into the writing field? Like, how did it start off for you?
Well, with writing, I grew up in a pre-internet world, and we didn't have cable till I was like 12 because it was that kind of place, rural place. And I used to watch shows like Masterpiece Theater on PBS, and of course all the kid shows on PBS like Sesame Street, Electric Company. And I used to watch Murder, She Wrote too because my parents loved that show. And I always wanted to be Jessica Fletcher because Jessica Fletcher was a writer, and she was very accomplished, and she was very smart, and she was, well, everything. But I always figured you needed connections to be a writer. And of course, Jessica had connections. Jessica had connections all over the place, but I didn't have any connections. And I figured that, growing up in a rural area, I was never going to have any connections. So I was never going to be a writer,
hmm
not a published one.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And what changed for you? What made you made you believe that you could be a writer? What actually got you started then?
Well, I always knew I could be a writer, but I didn't seriously consider publishing because, again, I thought publishing was about connections. And then I forget the actual year, the Amazon introduced its Kindle. And then when it introduced its Kindle, like just a couple of months later, it introduced what they call KDP, which is Kindle Direct Publishing, which meant all of a sudden you didn't need connections or to live in a big city to publish. You could send Amazon a manuscript and Amazon would publish it for you and they would sell it on their Kindle platform. And that opened a whole new world
hmm Okay,
because all of a
perfect.
sudden I didn't need to move. I didn't need to know anybody. I just needed to be a good writer.
Yeah, yeah. That's good. That's good. And it's crazy how companies like Amazon, they just change whole industries just with one basic shift to
Yeah.
where you could do it on your own. Now it's available to everyone.
It is amazing. And I like to call it the third biggest publishing revolution in all of human history because In terms of publishing revolutions, there have really only been three. The first
Mm-hmm.
one was the Gutenberg printing press in the 1400s. Second one was the invention of cheap papers and inks during the Industrial Revolution that allowed people like Mark Twain and Charles Dickens to get published. And the third one is right now. And I
Mm-hmm.
believe that every author should take advantage of what I'm calling the rise of the indie publisher right now.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Now, what about in terms of writing your own book, the first book that you wrote, in terms of writing that book, tell me about that experience there.
Okay, well, the very first book I wrote took a while to write, and then I sent it off to an editor that I found online. And the editor looked over it and basically told me they'd used many more words to say it, but that it was not a good book. They went into detail about how bad the character was, how bad the plot was, how bad this was and that was, and it's like, oh. And I was hurt, of course, because I worked hard on that book, but what I didn't really realize at the time was that because I never planned to publish, I'd never actually finished an entire story before. I didn't know what it took to finish a story, and clearly I didn't know what it took to write a book at that point so that it was a sellable book.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think based on reading your bio as well, so you said you had what was it, a lot of stories that you started but didn't complete, right? Like hundreds and hundreds of pages, right?
Oh yeah, hundreds and hundreds of pages of stories that I've started, got pretty much to the halfway point and just didn't finish and just put them away and then worked on them sometimes and rewrote scenes sometimes. But I never really gave them an ending, in the sense that even the stories that had endings didn't have middles leading up to that ending. They weren't finished stories.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you with writing? What type of are you more on the computer? Is it like through notebooks? How do you typically write?
Well, I tend to plan my characters in notebooks. I tend to do outlining through notebooks, but when it comes to the actual writing, computer all the way, because one, computers can go anywhere, and two, I have a talk to text program on my phone, which is awesome, and I can just open my document, talk to the phone, and it'll type. It's like having a transcriptionist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's pretty cool. I've experimented with the talk to write, but I've never got to the point where I actually use it all the time. It's mostly like I just type, but that's pretty cool. Do you find you use that talk to type a lot?
I use it a lot. I use it more in the second draft. Well, I use it more in the first draft than the second, because the thing is, when you're writing the first draft, you need to write that as quickly as possible. But when you're writing the second draft, you have to take your time and actually craft it. And the thing to remember about talk-to-text software is that it is both faster and not faster at the same time, because you can type more words, but more words are going to be wrong. So what you're not spending typing, you're spending editing.
Hmm. Okay, makes perfect sense. Okay, now tell me, did you have any mentors along your journey? How did you really hone in your skills in terms of writing?
Well, there weren't mentors who knew about me, but I remember right after Kindle came out, there was a girl named Amanda Hawking, and she wrote, I believe it was paranormal fiction, paranormal romance fiction, and she was Amazon's first Kindle millionaire by selling her books. And I hesitate to call them books, not because they're not good, but because they were very short. By today's standards, they'd be very short, but by those standards, there weren't a lot of Kindle books yet, and so they weren't short. But anyway, she wrote short books, and I bought one of those short books, and I realized that even though she's not necessarily a better writer, she was 10 times better storyteller. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms
So,
of, oh, go ahead.
pardon?
Go
Oh,
ahead.
I was going to say, so I realized that in order to be a better writer, I had to actually, do things that would make me a better writer and learn about the craft of writing, learn about plotting and outlining and why people like stories.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're saying ultimately, when you got her books, you realized she was a better storyteller. Now, do you believe that stories are what makes good writing? What do you believe?
Absolutely. But I think that there's a lot of confusion about what stories are. Stories are not events. A lot of writers get that wrong because they put in a bunch of events in their stories and they think it's a book. And it's like, no, because a story is not about an event. A story is about a character living through an event.
Mm,
Because if you can't get your characters right, you don't have a story. You just have a bunch of events with
wow,
some
that's
random people in
powerful.
them.
Mm-hmm. Wow, wow, awesome. Now, tell me, In terms of how did that experience shape you? So when you got Amanda's stuff, how did that kind of shape you? Did it shape you in any way? What did you end up doing?
Well, just because she was like the first book I bought, so
Mm-hmm.
so it's like that's kind of how it shaped me. But other than that, not necessarily, because I've always been an avid reader, and
Mm-hmm.
I read a lot. And I read a lot of books on everything. I read romance, I read horror, I read thriller and mystery and fiction and nonfiction and quantum physics and more history. And basically, I read everything. And in 2018, Amazon, who apparently does keep track of what you read, that's very big brotherish, but still interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Amazon told me I read 499 books in 2018. I'm like, really?
Now, did you read these books from cover to cover?
Yes, I did.
Wow.
That's how Amazon counts how many books you've read.
Uh-huh.
They don't count the ones you didn't finish.
Mm-hmm. Now, how do they track that? Did they track that? Do you have like a Kindle or something? How do they track?
Yes, I do have a Kindle app on my phone. I have a real Kindle too, but I usually use the Kindle app on my phone.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
the
they're
Kindle Kindle app on your phone is free, and I subscribe to what they call Kindle Unlimited, which is basically like what they used to call a private lending library, which is you pay a monthly fee, you get, I believe it's 10 books, and then you can return a book like a library and get a new book. So
mm-hmm.
you read 10 books, you return 10 books, you get 10 more books.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Okay, and
Netflix for books.
yeah, cool. And they're able to track that on that app that you use. How many you read?
Yes, they do track it on that app that I use. And another thing I like about Kindle, of course, is they sync it across all your devices. If I was reading it on my phone and then I switched to my Kindle and then I switch back to my phone, it knows exactly where I left off. And if I switch to Audible, because maybe I got the audio version too, it knows exactly where I left off and starts it right there.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And so tell me now, what about the first book that you've ever published? How did that first of all, how many pages did you write before you ever got to your actual your first published book? How many would you
Well,
say?
the first book I ever wrote was actually an anthology, and it was based on public domain works where I just deepened the characters and didn't have to think about the plot because the plot was there. It's an easy way to, get started for new writers. I have unpublished all those books now, so don't bother looking for them. They're not around anymore.
Mm-hmm.
My very first book, though, my very first novel, was not very long. It was about 35,000 words, which is short for a novel,
Ooh.
really a novella. And the thing about that book is that it took me 5 years to write because even though it was really short, I didn't know what I was doing at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, okay. So it took you about 5 years, huh? And would you say you were just experimenting with stuff? How were you taking the whole approach?
Definitely, I was experimenting with stuff. And every book I've written since then is a new experiment because that's what I like to do. I
Mm-hmm.
like to experiment with not only writing books, but with different ways to write books and different methods to write books faster. I've come a long way since my very first book. I can now, one of my latest books that I'm in the process of retitling is about 70,000 words, and I wrote that one in a month. It took about 2 months to plan it.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a lot of writing. Okay. And now tell me now, in terms of who you want this message to reach, who would that person be?
Well, I want it to reach people who know they have a book in them, but are scared to write it or who haven't finished it yet, because I want to let them know that now is the best time in history to be a writer, and now is the time to grab your opportunity and write and publish that book. And it doesn't have to be scary because anyone can write and anyone can learn what it takes to write. There is a system. I know it sounds bad to like systemize creativity, but it's like there is a system. There are skills you can learn. There are tricks you can do. There are things that will get you to the end of that book faster, and it'll be a better book because just because you wrote it fast doesn't mean that it's a low quality book. Not if you know what you're doing.
Hmm. Perfect. So you teach individuals how to write their own books?
I do.
Hmm. Okay, and that is so brilliant. So in essence, you basically you coach them. How does that process look?
Well, how that process looks is depending on what stage they come to me at. People who come to me with an idea, the first thing we do is refine the idea and figure out the best genre for the idea to be in. Now, genre is a fiction word, but it's not necessarily referring to just fiction books. For example, some memoirs are actually better off written similar to novels, but some memoirs are better off written to like an anthology.
Hmm.
Now, business books can be straight business books. They can be written like memoirs, or they can be written like allegories, like Who Moved My Cheese is an allegory book.
Mm-hmm.
So once we determine the idea and the best genre for it, we determine the subgenre for it. And by that, I mean we dig a little deeper. Now that we know the generals of what type of book it's going to be, this type of book. Then we dig a little deeper and figure out who's going to read this type of book. And then we figure out what that reader is looking for in this type of book. Because all readers are looking for different things.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to know the tropes of the specific subgenre that you pick in order to write a book that your readers love. And the example I'm going to give here is just romance, because this is just such a strong trope. People always come to me and go, I have a great idea for romance and it doesn't have a happy ending. And I'm like, no, that's not a romance. Romance by definition has a happy ending. It's like, you're not writing a romance.
Yes. Okay. And I guess the next question I have is in terms of mistakes you see most either individuals who want to get the book written or the ones who maybe they're considering writing a book. What are some big mistakes you've seen?
Well, some of the biggest mistakes I've seen is, this one's a big one, taking too long to write the book. Because, I took 5 years to write mine, and that is absolutely a mistake. Because the fact of the matter is, you are not the same person if it takes you longer than a year to write your book. You're not the same person at the end as you were when you started. So now your book doesn't resonate with you and it makes no sense. And you pretty much have to start it over again or try to make it match, which doesn't really work. So I am of the opinion you should write a rough draft in 2 months or less. That's mistake number 1. And mistake number 2, I see people do this one all the time too, is they don't know their characters well enough. Because a story is all about characters. And if you have no character, then you have no story. But a lot of people just throw characters into a world and expect them to do things, but they're moving them like marionettes. The characters have no agency of their own. This is why you see like stereotypical characters like you see in horror movies. It's like everybody knows the stereotypes of a horror movie, those characters. It's like everybody knows those characters aren't deep. Horror movies are famous for their characters not being deep. But whereas that genre can get away with it, no other genre can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Now, final question. If someone needs your services, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, my website is devlinblake.com, and I am also on Facebook, and I do love Facebook Messenger, so you can find me on Facebook too.
Love it. Awesome. And guys, hey, so thank you so much, Devlin. So what I'll do with the links to your Facebook, to your website, whatever you got, I'll go and put it right in the notes of this video, so that way someone could click on it and connect directly with you. So if you need, for the listeners listening out there, if you need a book written, if you have any questions about writing, Devlin, she is the go-to person. So be sure to connect with her. Well, Devlin, thank you so much for being on today's show. I really, really appreciate it. And do you have any final words before we sign off?
Nope, that's everything. Thank you
Awesome.
so much for having me on here, Extus.
You're so welcome. Well, really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch, okay?
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Awesome.